For this special episode of the Your Morning Coffee podcast, I sit down with DIMA President and CEO Grahama Davies. Before leading DIMA, which is the Digital Media Association, Graham has held several senior roles in the music business. He was the CEO of the Ivers Academy. In this episode, we sit down and discuss his goals, the latest DIMA annual report, the rise of AI-generated music, and much more. So now, without further ado, here's Grahama Davies on a special episode of the Your Morning Coffee podcast. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Graham, it's so good to see you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to talk with me all the way from London, England.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks, Jay. It's really good to see you again, and thanks for the opportunity.
Sure. So let's kick this thing off. Just for those with no previous knowledge, talk about what DIMA is and your role and sort of how it's evolved and how you approach this rapid growth of streaming and digital distribution.
Yeah, sure. So I think sort of about 19 months, maybe 20 months now into leading DIMA, which is the Digital Media Association. And DIMA has actually been in existence for over 25 years, but probably doesn't have the biggest profile. But in my time, we've been looking to grow that. And that's because we represent the leading music streaming services, which is Apple Music, Amazon, Feed FM, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. So clearly, very important organizations in the music industry, and have had this trade association, which has been focused in Washington, D.C., historically, very focused in and around the Music Modernization Act and publishing and licensing kind of issues up on the Hill. But increasingly, what we've been doing over the time that I've been there now is to see the opportunity for DIMA to speak on behalf of the services across perhaps a wider range of issues, but also across a bigger territory. So now we see ourselves as the voice of music streaming in the US, Canada, Latin America, and so in the Americas. That's still something that's a work in progress. We only started to really represent in Canada over the last year, and more newly this year, sort of properly speaking out in some of the Latin America territories.
It's been over a year and a half. I can't believe that. I remember when you first started, we had a conversation. That was over a year and a half ago. Boy, that's gone by fast. Well, it seems to me it's gone by fast. Has it gone by fast for you?
It has gone by really fast and slow. And that's often how you feel about periods that have been really full. Just a brief bit of background for those that don't know me, I have spent sort of 30 years in the music industry in the UK. And so my background was working for PRS for Music, which is the equivalent of ASCAP and BMI in the UK. I spent a good stretch of time there, working principally around digital transformation strategy. And after that, I worked for ASCAP and some other PROs briefly before then leading the Ivors Academy, which is the trade association for songwriters and composers in the UK. And they proudly put on the Ivor Novello Awards every year. So that was my journey up until this kind of 18, 19 months ago, when I left the UK and also moved sort of around the industry table to then represent the streaming services.
Talk about how DIMA balances the interests of these DSPs, these digital service providers, like you mentioned. How do you balance those interests with the rights holders and consumers and, all of this policy advocacy that you do? How do you balance all of that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it kind of talks to what I would see. And I think the response to the work that we've been doing is that the wider industry and the ecosystem really does actually value having DIMA as an interface to our members and the more collective position from the streaming services. So balancing the interests, primarily, the first thing out the gate is actually to advocate for the benefits of music streaming and the work that our members have done. It's not that long ago where, the consumer was used to piracy. We're both old enough to remember pre-digital days, but the early days of digital were peer-to-peer file sharing, and whenever you look at those IFPI or RAAA recorded media revenue charts, you could see the cliff of the value dropping, really, to the consumer getting used to getting music for free. And that was a really, really scary place to be. And so then our members have worked to kind of establish this fully licensed market, where I think arguably never in history have so many consumers been paying for music every month. When you look back to the buying habits of yourself and your friends and family, that tended to be a bit more sporadic, gifting, Christmas. Whereas now, I think in a way it is remarkable that we've been able to bring so many consumers to willingly pay every month to access the world's repertoire. And so in terms of balancing, that is a fundamentally hugely important piece for the industry. I think streaming is now, in many mature markets, 80+% of the recorded media revenues. So live is also, of course, an important revenue stream, but streaming now, it really is the one that is driving the industry's revenues and income. The jobs, importantly, the artists and performers and creators, but also, all the other roles that sit around that, is all being funded from streaming. So I think in terms of balancing the interests, it is really important that the role that the streaming services are doing is understood. Services need to take a margin. I think it's arguably the lowest margin of any of the licensing business models at circa 30%. So I think for me, one of the tasks is explaining the work that the services are doing, how they're investing in discovery, finding new artists, promoting new artists, and how our members, give access to information and data which artists and the industry can use to actually then further grow. Because what we're all about is innovation and growth, and keeping that success story going. So I think that that's the service kind of piece, but obviously it's really important that we're reliant so heavily on the supply chain. So the services are sat at the end of the supply chain. So the music is delivered, by the distributors and the record labels or independents that are making the music. All of the kind of the metadata. There's an awful lot of importance to the metadata in terms of the quality of the music that's coming through and the information. And then, there's differing views around, which I knew very much in my previous role, as to where does the money go and where are the issues in terms of where the money's going. And so, we aim to work with everybody. I think the services kind of do have this central position that we need to and we want to work with all parts of the industry. And so I think that for me, that's been one of the things in terms of me in this role, drawing on, some of my past work in music publishing and in the artist space is, I think, been helpful to that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the history, because this has to be one of the greatest turnarounds in business history. Watching the music industry, which some thought was done. It was over with all of the piracy, back in the late 90s and early aughts.
Yeah.
And it's
and to just give a stat on that, Jay. I mean, we've done so. I'm a bit of a plug here, if that's all right. But we published our annual report, which is available on our website. And please, listeners, do go and check it out. But we do some consumer research every year, and to the remarkableness of that kind of turnaround is also that, some of the data we're seeing is that very high satisfaction rates of consumers, 94%, for instance, love or like their streaming service. I mean, that's really extraordinary. And that I think that satisfaction is built on the product, of course, and the product is the best music in the world. I mean, whether it's local to where you live or abroad. But also, I think the offering is really now, very strong in terms of discovery value, which is, a contentious point, can be a contentious point in the industry as to price and the value that the consumer's getting. But the utility and just how music now is, being woven into everyone's lives in very different ways to how it was in the past. So I think that's, in terms of the turnaround you talked to, I think it really is remarkable.
Yeah, each DSP approaches this very differently, but I think the superpower is this curation and being able to understand each listener and sort of serve up music that they would appreciate and they will love. But it's also that discovery that you mentioned. I think people are discovering more new music now than ever, which leads me beautifully into the next question. There's a lot of talk today about AI generated music and emerging technologies. If you can get out your crystal ball for a second, Graham, like, where do you see the future sort of evolving here?
Yeah. And I think to absolutely sort of build on that, what it is that the consumers like, to your point, is that I know we know this, but as a comparison to broadcasting, where you had one to many, in the streaming model, the beauty of this is it's one to one. So the consumer dives in, perhaps from offline, having found some music that they're interested in from social media or wherever, and then that kind of choice then guides a discovery that they can go on, which is very individual to them. So I think from a DIMA perspective and the future ball gazing around AI, we obviously need to keep the consumer and their what the consumer wants paramount in our thinking. And I say that kind of collectively, because again, it is the consumer that is paying for the music to be generated in the fantastic industry that we're all a part of. At the other end of the scale, of course, the other parties that are super important to that is the creators, the songwriters, and the artists and the producers and everyone that is involved in the creation of the most amazing music. I think that in terms of the crystal ball is looking at the trends that we've seen, and I think they do present real challenges. And I say this again, when I was at the Ivers Academy, you could see the challenges that creators were feeling of how technology had reduced the barriers to people being able to create. So the number of creators is hugely greater than it was in the past. And if you are an existing professional musician from a previous period, you could feel like, oh my word, I'm now up against many more mouths to feed and much more competition. So I think that is something that we kind of do need to reflect on, and that, does anyone see that diminishing? I think quite the opposite. with AI then increasingly enabling us all to do more and more things ourselves, technology assisted. So I think that as a trend, I would imagine, is going to not diminish. And then I think in terms of, if that is where things are going, it is presenting, I think, some challenges for the existing streaming services model, because the consumer is then going to be potentially facing an awful lot more content. And a lot of the conversations we're starting to have at the moment are around, does the consumer need to know the extent to which AI was involved in the creation of the recording? Now, it could be that AI has been used for many, many years in the creation. Jay, I think you've the insides out of a studio. There's lots of equipment has been powered by AI of different kinds, and obviously we're now at the start of something that's much more significant in terms of what can be done. So we've started to hold an annual meeting with our members in New York, and we did a panel with some industry stakeholders on this topic of saying, what's the relevance of AI labeling in the future? Again, with perhaps a consumer mindset, will the consumer want to know if what they're listening to has been produced using AI? That becomes quite challenging when, well, do we mean all AI, all components of AI, or do we mean
tools?
AI tools? Do we mean the Randy Travis track, which arguably you could say, yes, actually that would be beneficial for the consumer to know, through to 100% AI generative music, where there's a particular feeling around that, and obviously it doesn't carry copyright, and then you've got issues around how should that be licensed. So I think in terms of the ball gazing, I'm not able to go particularly far out at the moment on that. I can see very much these are the issues we have right now, but we have started to say, actually, if AI tools become ubiquitous in our lives and in the creative process, it's not entirely clear, for instance, whether the consumer is going to be beneficial for the consumer to know where AI was used. Well, of course, AI was used, but lots of people are looking at this. It's a really important topic, and the reason I say that is because clearly rights owners want to know what the influx of large volumes of AI could be to disrupting the service model. And from our perspective, thinking about the consumer could also lose satisfaction in their streaming service if it becomes something that is overwhelmed by content that they don't want to listen to. So I think that's where it kind of also then goes into issues like stream manipulation and fraud, and just kind of huge volumes, and whether there's ways to start to kind of curtail the content coming in that form. So it's a big topic.
It is
lots to dive into over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's a lot more complex than you might think, because I can only speak for myself. If it's functional music, if it's music for sleep or lo-fi hip hop to study by or have in a background, I don't care how it's created. Right. It serves its purpose.
Right.
But if there's an artist that is being portrayed as a real human artist, I want to know personally, is that a real person? Is that, yeah. And that's okay. I mean, a great song is a great song, but personally, I want to know if it's creative. And then on the other side, another level of complexity is, how did that happen? Was it trained off of copywritten material? And is somebody, is there attribution? Is somebody getting paid for that? So you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many layers to this, but you just brought up something that I think doesn't get enough press. And that is basically the challenges of piracy and unauthorized use of digital content. And, that can be with AI, that can be with bots, which is just a fancy way of saying a little piece of software that maybe plays something over and over and over again to jack up the numbers, or spin farms where they have devices that generate spins after spins. And I know it's sort of like whack-a-mole. You find this behavior and you kill it, and then they get creative and find another way. Talk a little bit about the challenges of just this unauthorized use.
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, I have a long enough career to know, sadly, piracy is always there. I remember when I was at PRS, there was an anti-piracy unit for tracking down, fraudulent physical product. So I think maybe that's the nature of the world, is that there's always people looking to game a system, and I think that the numbers thus far haven't been that high. I think in relation to our members in terms of the volumes, but it doesn't take a lot of volume of that activity to, cause the system to feel like it's being undermined, and deep concern. So I think that, and another area for us is deceptive content, which is in the same kind of ballpark. So for the consumer, as you were saying, Jay, the consumer does not want to be deceived, and so I think that our members take this really seriously. Being at the end of the supply chain, though, they are very reliant on what comes through. So in terms of that attribution, is this legitimate content? Is this person's voice that they have, authorized to be used, or is it a deep fake? That's something we're working really closely with the industry to try and, bring forward on the no fakes legislation at the moment, to see what can be done in that space. And then working really closely with cross-industry players, Music Fights Fraud Alliance, for instance, to see how can information be shared so that bad actors can be identified in the system, at the earliest opportunity, and we can stop this stuff flowing through onto the services. Because once it arrives, our members are good actors and take it down if they're notified, as quickly as possible. But really, the issue is the services won't know. They don't have the information to know. If you take that Randy Travis, latest album as a case in point, that's authorized. That's Randy
100%.
said, you can use my voice, and this is actually from me, and but the services are way away from Randy and his label and that whole process. So we have to work, and we like to and need to work really closely with the industry to bring forward, a supply chain which is robust and, legitimate and healthy, so that everyone knows that the content that's coming through, is appropriate to come through.
Yeah. I want to step off and do something that's a little bit in the weeds, a little bit geeky. So bear with me here. A lot of people that I speak with in the business don't really understand the Copyright Royalty Board and sort of, phono records for, and, these little 5-year periods. I'd love to get sort of a quick overview from you of, the CRB and what's going on, with these settling these rates. But also how that sort of relates to Spotify's recent bundling that we've been talking about so much lately.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get you in terms of the weeds. And so the Copyright Royalty Board is very much a US kind of construction. And we have a blanket license in the US for mechanical rights. And once every 5 years, that's the term at which the value of the mechanical rights is set by the CRB. And so it's called phono records, an age-old construction of words here, which does relate to the streaming rates. And so in terms of backdrop, the last rates were set, it's actually not that many years ago, so maybe 3 or 4 years ago, which was Phono 4. And so the process for Phono 5 will start early next year.
And that sets rates for the next 5 years, correct?
It's so that for a 5-year period. So we would still be running through the existing Phono 4 period, but obviously getting ahead of what would the rates be beyond that. So So that's a process that just is coming down the pipe, and we need to gear up for it. But obviously, since the last phono rate setting, which was actually heralded as this big success because it was a settlement, and when I say the parties on that would be DIMA's members together with the NMPA, which represent the music publishers, and other kind of wider songwriter groups like NSAI and others. We achieved a settlement, which was excellent because the previous Phono 3 had been disputed and had been a long sort of process. So I think everyone felt very good to get a settlement on Phono 4. And it also, importantly, did have a whole set of terms relating to the rates, including bundling. But it also had the highest rate for the mechanical rights in the US ever. So, and they kind of stepped up through the 5-year period. So I think everyone felt that there was a win in the settlement. But since then, the application of the terms in those rates as they relate to bundling, which our members have sought to kind of implement, has given then rise to dispute, which was litigated. And I won't go too much into that because to an extent it's still a process underway. But I think that our view is that having certainty on these rates is super important for our members, but it's super important for the rights industry now. That earlier sort of stats that I was saying in terms of how important streaming income is to the industry, for everybody, having as much certainty and forward view on that is important. So we are sort of out there at the moment, sending the message that we really would like to start discussing and trying to get to a settlement for Phono 5. We just think that should be a key objective for everyone. Obviously informed by what's happened during the last period of implementation on the last rate setting, and in a way this 5-year point does helpfully provide a way if things are not as various stakeholders are happy with, where there's a chance now to kind of look at those things and discuss them in the next rate setting process. So I think that the benefits for the industry are, with that certainty, you get the growth that we've seen. Everyone can kind of invest in growing the market even more. So hopefully that wasn't too much in the weeds, but it's definitely something which is super important coming up.
Thank you for clearing that up for us.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago this annual report, which I found fascinating. There was a lot of great data about consumer engagement, with streaming and, how much people who stream music, how much they're spending. Can you talk about that a little bit, about that report and sort of what you learned?
Yeah, so what we've learned is that, that there is this super high engagement, that actually now streaming is kind of number one for all the key components, whether it's from discovery or using music, and streaming is kind of giving rise to further consumption and further purchasing off of streaming, exploration for live, people using music to accompany their mental health and lifestyle and healthy well-being and these kinds of things. We're finding that it's not just about new music. 63% of streamers are using streaming to explore back catalogs. And I think that combined with the information that we've kind of brought forward, but also that our members, particularly Spotify, do an awful lot of work with their Loud and Clear report, in that we're just seeing how important this global access to the global repertoire is. So you're seeing that, people are very much going on a journey of having music, as I say, that is important for their locality, but finding music from different genres and different geographies around the world, which is coming through in terms of the earnings that we kind of start to see that artists are getting. A lot of the money that artists that are earning over $1,000 a year or upwards, a lot of that is coming from music beyond their home location.
Yeah, and people can get this report at the DIMA website, correct?
That's right.
As we sort of wind down here, Graham, looking ahead, what are some of your priorities for DIMA over the next few years?
We're kind of, to an extent, responsive to what happens on the Hill, whether that's the Hill in Washington or the Hill in Ottawa, Canada, or the various kind of parliaments around the Americas. So it's a very combination of having some strategic goals for the organization, as well as just kind of being very responsive to what's happening. So at the moment, in the US, we are, as I say, very focused on the No Fakes Act. That's a really important piece of legislation that has gone, a good distance, but there's still further work that we need it to make before we could get to a point of supporting that. I think metadata is another thing that we've talked about, and the supply chain, particularly in the context of AI now. I'm starting to see that that's becoming a really important issue. DIMA and myself in my previous role with the IVES Academy, we kicked off an initiative called Credits Due, which is an industry initiative highlighting the issue of missing good metadata. And so I don't see that kind of diminishing over the period. And then for DIMA as an organization, we, as I say, are sort of building out now our representation beyond the US. So we gave some evidence to the Chilean Parliament a couple of weeks ago. We've been lobbying in Peru, becoming more active in Brazil and Mexico. So I think becoming more established in those territories, as you said, not that many people would necessarily know of DIMA. So we're having to, introduce ourselves in those markets and build relationships and start the process of adding value for our members there. So that will keep us busy without a doubt over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned metadata. It's not sexy, but it's one of those things that is so crucial to so many parts of our business that we have accurate metadata on so many different levels. Graham, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. Before I let you go, tell our listeners where they can learn more about all the things that you're doing with DIMA. Yeah,
so just go to DIMA.org. Nice and simple. If they head there, all of the information's up there, all the news, and then obviously kind of sign up to our socials as well.
Great. Thanks again, Graham. Let's talk soon.
Cheers, Jay.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.